Good evening, everyone. A warm welcome to the lecture Afghanistan, Imperialism and Fundamentalism, jointly conducting by Progressive Students Forum, TISS Mumbai, and Progressive Student Organization, TISS Hyderabad campus. I hope all of you are doing well at your place in these tough times. Myself, Fatima Sultana, doing a master's in women's studies at TISS Mumbai campus, and currently I am the General Secretary of Progressive Students Forum, TISS. Um, Before moving into the lecture, I would like to give a brief idea about PSF and PSO. We, Progressive Students Forum and Progressive Student Organization, our student organization work based on Mumbai and Hyderabad campuses of Tata Institute of Social Sciences, which aims to build a progressive and secular space and a culture of rational and inclusive thinking, which contribute to the larger struggles across the world. Uh, we also uh, stand for the democratic space to encourage debates and discussions for everyone in the campus by discussing and engaging in different political developments happening in our country and across the world. And we also raise our voices on behalf of the student body. This lecture is also a extension of our such activities. And we know that people across the globe are going through the toughest times in their lives. The COVID-19 pandemic has worsened our struggles we are facing already due to the existing system. Many among us already, many among us lost our near and dear ones, and many are ailing with the difficulties brought by the pandemic to their lives and livelihood. Adding to this uncertainty brought by COVID-19 pandemic, the people of Afghanistan forced to fall into the state of fear and uncertainty again. The Taliban has recaptured the power in their country after the 20 years long US-led invasion in the name of fighting terrorism. We know that past decades, including imperialist wars, Taliban rule, and the mismanagement of subsequent puppet governments, uh, have brought immense suffering and destruction to the lives of the people of Afghanistan, as well as its infrastructure, economy, and the very fabric of socio-political fabric of their country. And we could say that undoubtedly any concrete understanding of the current situation in Afghanistan need to examine the mutually reinforcing character of imperialism and religious fundamentalism. Here, for our lecture today on Afghanistan and Taliban issues, we are honored to have Dr. Vijay Prashad as speaker, whom I know I don't need to give much introduction from my side. Dr. Prashad, who is a well-known historian, intellectual, journalist, and activist who has been working across the left movements globally. He is the director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, also chief editor of Leftward Books, New Delhi, and he is also the chief correspondent of Globetrotter and columnist for Frontline. And he is the author of several books, including Washington Bullets, and frequently writes in many leading publications. Also, I am happy to add that our lecture would chair by Dr. Irfan Engineer. He is the director of Center for Society and Secularism based on Mumbai. He is a prominent social scientist, activist, and worked for many decades on the issues ranging from human rights to fighting communalism. I am also expressing my gratitude to both of the speakers, who were with us during different occasions in 2016, and this time they are together as a guest. And I'm not elaborating much. Our lecture would officially start with the chair speech by Dr. Irfan, engineer, and following him, Dr. Prashad would speak, and at the end of the session, the floor will be open to the discussion. I'm also requesting the audience, if you have any questions for the speaker, you could type in the comment box. We will take that into the speaker. And also, once again, I would like to welcome all of you to the lecture on behalf of Progressive Students Forum as well as Progressive Student Organization. Over to you, sir. Irfan, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Fatima, and thank you, Progressive Students Forum and Progressive Students Organization, for having me on this program. It is indeed really good that you have taken the initiative and organized today's talk on such an important topic, such a word. And there's a lot of confusion actually. Everybody is saying that let's wait till the developments, till we know fully well the developments. The shape of things that are going on in Afghanistan are not yet clear, and all kinds of confusion is there. But we'll try and throw some light through this program. And I'm sure Dr. Vijay Prashad will also throw a lot of light on the history of Afghanistan and how the whole thing developed. But still, we can throw some, say something about what's going on. First of all, uh, U.S. has been caught pants down. It's naked today. The way it left Afghanistan, withdrew from its army from the Afghanistan after entering into a withdrawal agreement with Taliban, in which they would not attack while they are withdrawing. They ended all the hostilities, and within days of uh, commencement of the withdrawal, Afghanistan fell, Kabul fell. I mean, it was people just were surrendering one after the other. US had trained 3 lakh Afghan soldiers, equipped them with best of weapons, and yet uh, about 55 to 60,000 Taliban soldiers. That's the figure that we get. Uh, Fighters, Taliban fighters, they could capture state after state in Afghanistan. How did this situation come about? This is second Vietnam. The arrogance of imperialism is down today. Uh, Imperialism cannot solve any problems. They can only create further problems. In fact, the whole war on war on terror, global war on terror, so-called global war on terror, was actually not war on terrorism. It was war against certain. It was actually invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, occupying it, carpet bombing, uh, about 2.5 lakhs. Some say about 3 lakh people were killed in Afghanistan alone through their bombing, aerial bombings and carpet bombings and bombings of all kinds. President Bush at that time used the word, "We'll smoke them out of their rat holes." This is the language that was being spoken at that time. And we see the results. The result is US, after uh, sacrificing their 2,500 soldiers who were killed in the war, uh, 2.5 lakh Afghans killed, 69,000 Afghan soldiers killed. That is the National Army of Defense and Security Forces. 69 soldiers were killed. So many people made. 2.7 million refugees after creating this big humanitarian crisis. What have they achieved? They are handing the power back to Taliban. Uh, that's because democracy cannot be imposed from the top. It comes through people's struggle. The importance of people's struggle, participation of people's struggle is so important. And it's only people who should throw out authoritarian regimes or wherever there is no democracy and people oppressed. The people of that country have to throw. World can only express solidarity, but the agency has to be people of that country, and that was being violated. This is second Vietnam for U.S. imperialism. The way they are running away, the way they are handing over everything to, they are forced to hand over everything to the Taliban. Now, this Taliban rule also was from 1996 to 2001 was worse experience for people of Afghanistan at that time. These are all the issues that are going to come up in the discussion. And I hope you'll have many questions and we'll be happy to address those questions. It meant oppression of minorities, particularly uh, women. Uh, I mean, actually, entire people of Afghanistan were feeling oppressed under Taliban rule. Women could not move out of their house. They were not allowed without a male escort, mehram as they are called. That is male escort. The male escort should be one with whom they cannot marry or husband. They were not allowed to work outside. All kinds of punishments were given to women, stoning to death, cutting off of hand, literal imposition of Sharia. Now, some will say America is saying this is what Islam is for you. The Hindu nationalists in India are saying this is what Islam is. Islam is terrorism, it's backwardness, it's conservatism, it is anti-women. This is how they are trying to project Islam. Both Hindu nationalists, Hindutva, America, American imperialism, and Taliban, the Muslim fundamentalists themselves are giving this, and they gave this picture of Afghanistan from 1996 to 2001. No freedom, no democracy, and not only women, actually Hazaras, Shia Hazaras, Uzbeks, Tajiks, all of them were feeling oppressed, and they were fighting against Taliban. The Northern Alliance was fighting against uh, Taliban and Talibani rule, this fatwa rule. Uh, they were ruling in the name of Islam. Is this what Islam is? I would say no. This is not the picture of Islam, and this is not the picture of Islam that you see in many liberal Islamic countries, whether it's Indonesia, whether it's Malaysia, uh, uh, whether they are South African African countries, some of the African countries where you have Muslim majority and democracy in those countries, West Asian countries. This kind of Islam has been created and imposed by US imperialism. Taliban, the word Taliban means students. These are the students of madrasa. They were actually CIA prepared their uh, syllabus, what to teach them. When Afghanistan was under Soviet occupation, they were telling this refugees from Afghanistan who had entered Pakistan and who were being educated in madrasas that the Soviet army is atheist, rationalists. They are anti-God. Therefore, you need to fight. The syllabus that they were being taught in madrasa, they were actually equipped. Uh, Taliban, or what from 1996 to 2001 were Taliban. Most of them were trained in Pakistani madrasas and they were madrasa students, and therefore they are called Taliban. And the syllabus was prepared by CIA. CIA not only trained them, they also funded them and equipped them to fight the Soviet army. And Taliban could come to power from 1996 and 2001, and imposed this kind of Islamic rule, which had to be fought. Does Islam say, is Islam intolerant? I would say that if Islam was intolerant, then Indonesia, Malaysia, whole lot of Muslim majority countries would have been intolerant. But you see greater and greater tolerance in Islam. The Islamic text, Quran, I mean, there are differences of opinion. There is fundamentalist reading. There is progressive reading of Quran. But if you see progressive reading of Quran, there are many verses which says that men and women are equal. uh, uh, Allah created men and women in couples, or entire creation was in couples, so that they know each other, they love each other. Uh, uh, about husband and wife, one of the verse in Quran says that men are jewel of women, husband is jewel of wife, and wife is jewel of husband. So they are both jewels of each other, and both have to be, both have duties, and both have their freedoms. Uh, so many people read gender equality in Quran. My own father was an Islamic scholar, wrote extensively about gender equality in Quran. Also, there is a concept of protection of uh, minorities under Islamic rule. And when we, whether during Umayyad period, whether during Abbasid period, or during Fatimid period, we saw religious diversity being protected, or even during Ottoman Empire, which was one of the longest lasting empires. It was spread right up to East Europe, up to Asia Minor, uh, West Asia, North Africa. Ottoman Empire was one of the biggest empires of its time, and it could grow because of religious freedom and tolerance. Well, there were times when certain sultans were intolerant and became more fundamentalist, but by and large, it was religious. So this is not inherent in Islam. This is the Talibani rule is Talibani rule. It is Wahhabism. It is conservative, fundamentalist Islam, what they were taught in Pakistani madrasas, and it is backward looking. The rule of Taliban today and in 1996 and from 1996 to 2001, I would say is failure of imperialism, and we have to see all that. There is a talk that Taliban has now changed. They are giving that those kind of signals that we have changed. Uh, uh, but if you read their statements very carefully, uh, first of all, if you see what President Biden is saying, President Biden is now putting the entire blame of Talibani resumption of Talibani rule in Afghanistan on the Afghan government. You trained them. You ran that puppet regime uh, of Afghan government, which was unpopular, which was actually corrupt in many ways, uh, which was modern looking, but not democratic, or not something that people of Afghanistan wanted. It was imposed by imperialist army of them, and therefore uh, people were resisting. Unfortunately, Taliban took that initiative in resisting U.S. rule, whereas it should have been progressive forces that should have resisted uh, this Talibani rule. Uh, Now US is saying that we are not into nation building. 20 years ago when they entered, that was their slogan, that we are entering for nation building. They have left more destructive Syria, destructive and damaged Iraq. Uh, Wherever they have entered, their footprints are that of damage. Nowhere they have done nation building. They enter with the slogan of democracy and nation building, and now conveniently they are saying it is the Afghan forces that should have fought, and we are not in business of nation building because they are defeated. Has Taliban changed? They are giving mixed signals. uh, their leadership is giving signal that no, we are changed Taliban. we will give freedom to women. I think that's more of signaling to the international community uh, with the hope that they gain more recognition in the international community. But international communities having wait and watch approach, rightly so. But on ground in Afghanistan, the Taliban fatwas, and if you carefully study their statement, that women will have as much freedom as uh, under Sharia. Once you talk about no democracy, once you talk about Islamic Emirat of Afghanistan, and you talk about Sharia rule, which they are saying there will be Sharia rule in Afghanistan, there is a question of freedom of women or those of minorities, Uzbeks, Kazakhs, Hindus, Sikhs, Hazara Shias, and they are all Afghan nationals actually, Afghan citizens. Uh, the minorities have no security. 250 Sikhs and Hindus have huddled themselves into Gurudwara, hoping that they will be. And the rush at the airport, the chaos at the airport makes it clear that people of Afghanistan are not believing them and they want to go out. One final point I'll make, and I'll end my talk. Hindutva and BJP government has completely failed in their policy towards Afghanistan. They see the entire situation through Hindu nationalist framework and Hindutva framework. On one hand, they are seeing a threat of Taliban and they are scaring people of India that there will be terrorism now, Islamic extremism now, and see Islamic extremism has entered Afghanistan. After Afghanistan, it will enter into Pakistan, and via Pakistan, it will come to Kashmir and rest of India. They are telling us Taliban is backward. Are Hindu nationalists any better? It's just change of color. Hindu fundamentalism versus Islamic fundamentalism. The same oppression of women we see in India. The number of sexual assaults on women, control of marriages, anti-conversion laws, uh, oppressing minorities in India. So Taliban and Hindutva, it's just different colors with same outcome and same results. Maybe question of degrees. And the question of degrees is not because Hindutva is any better in its outlook than Taliban. It is because India has a democratic constitution, and democratic constitution puts certain constraints on them to be able to bring out fast, rapid changes. But we see the same mob lynching on Indian soil as we witnessed in 1996 to 2001 under Taliban in Afghanistan. So I don't see any hopes. And finally, I will say that in India, uh, we need to fear Taliban only. Indian Muslims have so far not spoken up. Some individuals here and there have spoken up and expressed their joy or welcome Taliban in Afghanistan. But by and large, mainstream Muslim organizations have not spoken up, so we don't know their mind. Uh, they will not. My hunch is that they will not support terrorism of any kind. They have openly said, Indian Muslims and mainstream organizations, even conservative organizations, Muslim organizations in India, have always denounced terrorism. They will also denounce terrorism of Taliban. Uh, Although some of their social policies they may welcome, but not otherwise. We need to be democratic now. Indian democracy has to assert if India is fair with minorities and majorities, if India remains secular, then we need not fear terrorism of Afghan. We need to express our solidarity with people of Afghanistan and their struggle for democracy. We need to give refuge to those who come to India fleeing from Afghanistan, those who are oppressed in Afghanistan and come to India, irrespective of religion. Hindus should be welcome, Sikhs should be welcome. All those who face the oppression of Taliban should be welcome in India, and India should give them refuge uh, and all the support. Yes, I finish.
Okay. Okay, I suppose it's me now. Thanks a lot, Irfan, for that. That was very interesting and instructive, and the politics very clear. I'm very happy that PSF has asked me to come here. I enjoyed very much coming to TISS. I think just a few years ago when progressive students launched in Mumbai, and I congratulate you for persisting and continuing. Ramadas for inviting me, Fatima for your opening remarks. I think the first thing to say is that this particular event on the 15th of August in Afghanistan isn't the first major defeat for the United States military and for the US political establishment. They suffered 3 concurrent defeats, and I think it's important to just mention those. Right after the US entered the war against Afghanistan in October 2001, it began to plan an illegal war against Iraq, which it started in March 2003. And then, of course, didn't quite work out the way the United States thought it was going to work out, because pro-Western liberal government didn't come to power in Baghdad. Instead, you had a government which looked largely to Iran for inspiration. That government in 2011 passed a law basically annulling any extra legal protections for US troops in Iraq, which is why the United States pulled out of Iraq in 2011. That's a strategic defeat. It's true, the US remains in northern Iraq, in the Kurdish controlled areas, but it's a much smaller footprint, and technically they shouldn't even be there. But this was a major defeat for the United States. Secondly, February-March 2011, United States and NATO went to war against Libya. No pro-Western democratic government was produced there. Instead, you had 2 governments and a chaotic situation. One government backed by Turkey, the other government backed by United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. No victory for the United States. In Latin America, United States tried very hard to do a coup against Venezuela. That failed. No chance of getting that through. There was a coup conducted in November 2019 against the government of Evo Morales in Bolivia. That was reversed this year in an election where the Bolivian people fought off the coup regime. United States is seeing a number of political and military defeats. I want to start by saying we shouldn't exaggerate these, because the United States continues to have immense military power. The United States continues to have immense power over diplomatic institutions and financial systems. It's able to sanction countries and so on, which is why about 30 countries out of the 193 countries in the UN are under unilateral US sanctions, for which reason there's a group formed called Group in Defense of the UN Charter, led by Venezuela, Iran, China, and others, about 18 countries, a formal group at the United Nations. They have taken a position against the sanctions regime. So I want to make the first point. The US has had major strategic military defeats, yes, true. But US military power remains extraordinarily dangerous and lethal. United States can come in and bomb any country and destroy infrastructure and so on. They don't feel hemmed in, despite the fact that there has been a challenge, at least in Ukraine, by the entry of Russian troops in 2013, and in Syria, in the entry of Russian troops in September 2015. So despite all that, the US feels absolute confidence to go and bomb anywhere. In fact, US troops left Afghanistan, and the next thing we see is US troops entering the Democratic Republic of the Congo in the name of fighting ISIS. I'll get back to that. There's massive US military power. there's also control over these other institutions, especially financial institutions. So US power continues to be quite considerable, even though US authority has declined greatly, and the capacity of the United States to develop, to build societies in their own image, what they would like to see, that's not possible. We have entered the threshold of something like a multipolar world, but we're not there yet. This is going to be a big struggle, and the United States is not going to give up easily. That's the first point I wanted to make. Second point I wanted to make was, this war started in October 2001. Many of us right then were cautioning, saying that this is going to be catastrophic for the Afghan people. We cautioned and said that, look, the Taliban is not going to be easily defeated. It has a way of returning because it has safe haven in Pakistan. It has an ability to fight against corruption, and I'll come to that. That's a very important thing that the Taliban has. It's not just that they say we are Muslim fundamentalists. They have this whole corruption agenda, anti-corruption agenda, which is very powerful and shouldn't be set aside. Leftward has just republished a book I wrote in 2001. Published in January 2002, called War Against the Planet, and Ejaz Ahmed's book, The Imperialism of Our Time, published in January 2004. Both of these books take the position that this is going to be a catastrophic war, and that it's unlikely that the war aims articulated by the United States will be met. Unfortunately, came true, because the price paid for the failure is not in the United States. The price paid for the failure is in the Afghan people. There were essentially two war aims that the US articulated. One, to defeat and disband Al-Qaeda. Now, it should be said that Al-Qaeda wasn't really defeated directly, although it's true that Al-Qaeda hasn't been able to conduct a major attack on the United States. Al-Qaeda immediately, because of its nature as a tentacular organization filled with, the tentacles, a very limited body, disappeared from Afghanistan, went into Pakistan, and you saw the disruption it created in Pakistan, in Waziristan, and the northern provinces and so on, went off into Central Asia. The Al-Qaeda made its appearance on the African continent, strengthening very hard right-wing forces in Kenya, in North Africa, Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb. You had the Libyans return from Afghanistan and create chaos in Libya. That was the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. So bizarre that they were bombed in Afghanistan by the United States and then went to Libya, where they received friendly US air cover in order to overthrow the government of Muammar Gaddafi. The very same people, veterans of the Afghan struggle. Same in Syria. Many, not only Syrian Al-Qaeda, but Al-Qaeda from around the world, including Uyghurs, Uzbeks, and so on, entered into Syria. They had been attacked in Afghanistan by the United States, and now the United States providing them with air cover, logistical support, and so on, to go and overthrow the government of Bashar al-Assad. So Al-Qaeda really wasn't defeated. That war aim was not entirely met, although it's true that there was no attack on the United States. Second major war aim was to destroy the Taliban. Of course, now that is plainly not true. Taliban is back in power in Kabul, back in power in most of Afghanistan. They were not able to do this, and I'll come to that, as I said, regarding the corruption issue. They were not able to do this. The Taliban vanished in October 2001. They did suffer some military defeats, some deaths, especially in the northern areas in Mazar-e-Sharif. They suffered some very significant defeats from aerial bombardment in Kandahar, in Jalalabad, and then, of course, in the Tora Bora area, where there was a lot of life lost of Taliban fighters. But they did cross into Pakistan, many of them, because that border is largely delimited. It's not agreed upon by any government in Afghanistan and the Pakistanis. They came across. They took refuge in the old camps from Peshawar all the way out to Waziristan. They regrouped and they started coming back to fight in the summer of 2002. The United States actually has not met any of its objectives, the least of which was the propaganda that they used to enter into Afghanistan, which is that they're coming to save the lives of Afghan women and so on. This cannot be taken seriously. And again, I'll return to that. Okay, so the war was prosecuted. The United States committed significant resources, and so did NATO. Now, it turns out, thanks to WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, whose organization provided us with so much material, is still sitting in Belmarsh prison in the UK. It's shameful what is being done to Julian Assange. WikiLeaks just released another text which showed the Swedish government thinking about entering the conflict in Afghanistan so as to test weapon systems against the Taliban. This is exactly what the Israelis do against the Palestinians. It's a disgraceful, shameful thing. Europeans really need to consider what they were doing in Afghanistan, whether they were there, to test weapon systems or whatever. These issues need to be raised in European parliaments. And I very much hope that sensitive liberal people in the Swedish parliament raise this issue, not to necessarily embarrass the government, but to embarrass the public, which supported a war for these kind of petty pecuniary arms dealer type ends. So I hope there's a serious discussion in Europe about these issues. Well, the United States and the Europeans spent almost, over $90 billion on training an Afghan National Army. This Afghan National Army was a site of great corruption. There's 300,000 supposed troops. The United States reports by themselves indicate a few years ago that 42,000 of those troops were in name only, and the US government calls them ghost soldiers. Somebody was claiming the salaries of these soldiers, but they were not there on the ground. Plus, they had no real mission. After the government of Hamid Karzai, you had the government of Ashraf Ghani. Now, Ashraf Ghani was a former World Bank official. His vice president, who's now trying to fashion himself as the president, Amarullah Saleh, was a CIA asset right after 9/11, September 2001, worked with the CIA up to 2004 when he became the Afghan government or the Karzai government's head of intelligence. He took that post till 2010 and then was made Ashraf Ghani's vice president to placate the US. He's sitting in the Panjshir Valley with the son of Ahmad Shah Massoud. But this is not a serious rebellion. Mr. Saleh, as I said, is a former CIA asset. Don't know what his relations with the CIA is now. And Ahmad Shah Massoud, as you know, was working with the CIA before 9/11. He was assassinated by Al-Qaeda just a few days before 9/11. This is not a serious uprising. I doubt it will have any legs. Afghan people in general are exhausted by this long war. They don't want to return to it. And I think it's a criminal act if the United States starts to support Mr. Saleh and Mr. Massoud to continue the war by this proxy means. That would be really shameful, and I hope that doesn't happen. So the war was not really a war at the end, and you could see that the United States had no faith in the Afghan National Army. Mr. Biden's racist, ridiculous comments about how they don't want to fight, the Afghans basically not courageous and so on. It's ridiculous because after all, the Taliban also Afghans, and they fought pretty valiantly. So making these kind of cultural statements is racist and objectionable. And the United States at the end went to aerial bombardment in northern Afghanistan during the Taliban's last big push in the several districts in the north, the provinces in the north. US went to aerial bombardment with B-52s, killing civilians, also a wedding party and so on. So, I mean, just put it on the table. This was not a war that the US was fighting in a way that could have been won. It really wasn't that kind of war. Now, you've got to understand that when the British first went into Afghanistan in the 19th century, they developed a set of stereotypes, racist stereotypes about the Afghan people that continue to this day. And are mobilized, as Irfan said, by the Indian government, the current Indian government. One is that Afghanistan is a barbaric, backward place, tribal-ridden and so on, with no capacity for history, meaning they will continue to return to the 6th century or the 5th century or whatever. They have no capacity to drive a history forward. This is a completely erroneous formulation, as I'm going to show factually. It's completely erroneous, but it's what was there, pushed by British writers in the 19th century, but the backward Afghan, backward but noble. This comes to the poem by Rudyard Kipling, East is East and West is West, never the twain shall meet. It's rooted in the story of Afghan savage nobility. This is the idea that the British put forward. It's totally erroneous idea. Second idea that the British put forward after their defeat in the first Afghan war, that Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires. It's also not true. It's not the graveyard of empires. It's just another country where people want to fight for their sovereignty. That's different from being a so-called graveyard of empires. It's a very convenient way of saying that when you lose a battle, it's because everybody loses a battle. And by the way, everybody doesn't lose a battle. The Afghans did lose in 1878-80 in the second Afghan war. So that's another way of saying nobody take responsibility. They are savages and they defeat everybody. And so just let them be in their savagery. It's a very offensive ideological thing, which we can see repeated over and over again in the media, repeated over and over again. Look at the focus of the media coverage. It's all on Kabul airport, how to get people out. What about going and interviewing people in Kabul, talking to people in Jalalabad, in Herat, seeing what the politics are within Afghanistan? And that's the last thing I'm going to talk about. Okay, quickly, how to dispel that myth. Firstly, in Frontline, the current issue, I have a very long piece, not that long, 2,000-word piece on the fight inside Afghanistan over social reform. It begins in 1911. After subjugation to the British, many Afghans went into exile, particularly to the Ottoman Empire. There, they got a grip of the Tanzimat reforms. They understood what was happening outside their own society, and they brought some of these ideas back. Not because Afghanistan is not capable of generating it, but because this is how social reform takes place. People borrow, they are like magpies in the way in which we learn from each other and so on. When Mr. Mahmoud Beg Tarzi comes back from Istanbul, he comes along with Asma Khayyum, very significant person, born Damascus, 1877. They come back to Kabul in 1911. He starts a magazine. She starts a journal for women. They push an agenda inside Afghanistan, start a debate amongst the aristocratic elite. Their daughter, Soraya, marries the son of King Habibullah, who in 1919 becomes King Amanullah. And he genuinely opens a period of reform. It's Soraya and Asma Khanum that start the first girls' school in Afghanistan, in Kabul. That's a significant development. They start asking questions about polygamy, child marriage, issues that have been debated all around the world at around the same time, all around the Muslim world. It should be said that Mr. Tarzi was an acquaintance, a friend of Jalaluddin Afghani, one of the great reformers, Muslim reformers of that period. These ideas, again, swirling around the Muslim world, take root in Afghanistan. And you can see when Amanullah opens up this period of social reform, there is resistance. But where does the resistance come from? From the clergy, sections of the clergy, sections of the landlord class, the big landlords, and some tribal leaders. They object to the reforms, but they persist. In 1929, there's a coup against Amanullah done by this right-wing section, and he goes off into exile. Now, already the story is set in play. We have a section of Afghan society which wants to drive a social reform agenda forward, and we have a section of Afghan society which wants to contest it. And look where British imperialism comes in. Amanullah and Soraya go for a trip around Europe in 27, 28. Queen Soraya meets people. She doesn't wear a veil, which she didn't wear in Kabul either. She eats dinner with men, foreign men. They sit in delegations. The French president kisses her hand. British pick up a bunch of photographs of her doing these things, and British intelligence distributes this around Afghanistan because they want to undermine the king and queen, the king Amanullah, who's just defeated the British in the Third Afghan War. So the British weaponize the right wing and use it against Amanullah. There's therefore a coup against him, a fight against him. Now, just the grammar of this is set in 1919. You don't even have to go to the communist government from 1978 onwards. This is already set in 1919. It's nothing to do with the communists coming in and pushing a reform agenda. This is there from 1911, long before there's a communist party in Afghanistan. And the grammar is set. The imperialists sit on the side of the conservatives against the side of reason and so on. Well, this doesn't stop things. Nadir Shah, other kings, and then others in civil society, particularly educated middle-class members, try to drive an agenda. Initially, it's an elite agenda that gets pushed, education for girls, and so on. There are 5 constitutions written in Afghanistan. 1923 is the main one coming out of Amanullah, 1964 from King Zafar Shah, 1976, 1987, and 1995 constitutions written in Afghanistan. These 5 constitutions established equality for men and women, established the need for universal, some kind of education, and so on. It becomes more and more universal when we get to the communists. So this agenda is rooted in Afghan society. It's not external to Afghan society. It's right there in the middle of it. Well, here I would like to point out that when the communists come on the scene in the 1960s, led by my dear friend Anahita Ratebzad, who was one of the first 4 women to enter the Afghan parliament in 1965, based on the 64 constitution. She represented a district of Kabul and was the founder of the Democratic Women's Association of Afghanistan in 1965. When communists come on the scene, they basically absorb the social reform agenda of the previous era. End to polygamy, end to child marriage, girls' education, boys' education for that matter, education for everybody, and so on. But they add 2 important things to it. They add land reform as an agenda to undermine the big landlords in the countryside, the big bays of the countryside, and they add on mass literacy, which had not been there. In fact, when the communists conduct the Saur Revolution in April of 1978, literacy rates in Afghanistan were 18%. 18%, imagine that. So 18,000 workers go out into the countryside, most of them communists, to increase literacy. Now, let's switch to the other side of history. Before the communists come to power, there was a liberal aristocratic prime minister, president, Mohammad Dawood, who was in power. In 1972, Dawood tried to drive again the social reform agenda, and a professor of theology who had created the Jamaat-e-Islami, Burhanuddin Rabbani, decided to contest Dawood. Dawood was going to arrest him. Now, remember, Dawood is not a communist. Dawood is a liberal. Was going to arrest Rabbani because Rabbani and his students like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, Ahmad Shah Massoud, don't understand how Mr. Massoud is treated as some sort of hero now. These men, as students in Kabul University, where Rabbani was the professor of Islamic theology, were fighting women not to have them come onto campus, including throwing acid in the faces of women. So Mr. Mohammad Dawood was going to arrest Rabbani. Rabbani decamped to Pakistan in 1973, set up the camps there. Now, inside Afghanistan, the communists are driving a mass literacy campaign trying to increase literacy from 18%. In the camps, by 1986, camps run by people like Mr. Rabbani, 1986, girls' education, 1.4% of girls in Peshawar in these Afghan camps are being educated. Now think about that, 1.4%. That's the root of this counter-revolutionary section. These people, Rabbani, Hekmatyar, even Ahmad Shah Massoud, would have been footnotes in history, friends. They would have been footnotes in history had not the Pakistani government, particularly after Ziaul Haq's military coup, the Saudis, with all their petrodollars after the 1973 oil battle, and the United States, but fundamentally the United States, if they hadn't come and tipped the scales of history on the side of these wretched men sitting in Peshawar and in Waziristan and so on, if these wretched men didn't have these powerful outside actors, Afghanistan would have had a different history. And that's where the disaster starts. They armed them, they financed them, and they gave them diplomatic cover. They called them freedom fighters, for God's sake. Dick Cheney, for instance, called these people freedom fighters, but he called Nelson Mandela terrorists. This is the character of imperialism. It is fundamentally articulated to fundamentalism. They send these fellows across the border, increased support after the communists came to power in April 1978. communist agenda was being directly attacked by these people. Their gunmen came across and started shooting those 18,000 literacy workers, these very brave and sensitive people who went out across Afghanistan trying to increase reading, writing, rationality in the public. These fellows came across the border with US guns and shot them, started to shoot them. It's at that point that the communist government itself in disarray. Look, I'm not going to excuse the fact that the communist government was in disarray. There were two factions, Khalq and Parcham. They were fighting each other. There was accusations of one or the other person being a CIA agent, whether it's Amin or Tariqi or whatever, Babra Kamal going off, and it's chaos in Kabul. No doubt about that. Nonetheless, they request the Soviets to assist them. Soviets crossed the Amur Darya after 8 months of deliberation. Yuri Andropov in the Politburo did not want to enter Afghanistan, but they felt compelled to come in because they felt that this left government in Afghanistan, which was not a stooge government, the left government in Afghanistan was facing an attack from the conservatives backed by the imperialists and so on. So, I mean, this is the context of the Soviet entry. That was a catastrophic entry. The Soviets should not have entered like that. It just increased the propaganda that the United States was able to use. They put more money into this Mujahideen. Mujahideen came across the border, ruthless killings, but they were deeply corrupt. And that's the thing I wanted to point out. And it's because they were corrupt, each road having 10 checkpoints and so on, that the Taliban grew in the camps of Pakistan. They're basically the descendants of the Mujahideen, but they had a position against corruption, a fundamental position against corruption. So when they come into the country in around 93, 94, 95, they sweep the country because they say we're just like the Mujahideen, except we're not corrupt. And they enter Kabul in 96 and brutally kill the last left president of Afghanistan, Muhammad Najibullah. Muhammad Najibullah makes a speech, my friends, at the non-aligned meeting where he warns the world. He says, listen, these people, the West, they don't care about Afghan lives. 10,000 Afghans die, they don't care. One Westerner dies and they go into real shock. He said there's a racism involved. That was his speech at the non-aligned meeting. It's well worth looking at. At any rate, the Taliban come to power then. Now, in this 100-year period, there is a contest that includes Afghans. The Afghans are fighting over how they should develop their society. This is not a backward country. Please don't repeat that. And also, it's not a graveyard of empires. It's merely people trying to build their country. They don't have some great, existential role that all empires should come there and get defeated. They just want to build their own society. Afghans are noble, sensitive people who want to build their own society. There are some crackerjack people within their country, just like in any country. I mean, look at India now. I mean, there's a straightforward contest on what is India. What is the idea of India? Should India be a Hindu majoritarian society? Should it be a secular society? Similar debate in Afghanistan. We should have some compassion for their debate. Right now, the forces of rationality and reason and so on are very much in the minority, very much in the minority. And that's why people are kind of grasping at straws and saying this is a moderate Taliban. It's not a moderate Taliban. Mullah Baradar, who is going to basically be the main guy in charge, was one of the founders of the Taliban, very close friend of Mullah Umar, the previous emir of Afghanistan during Taliban rule, and the mentor to Mullah Umar's son, Yaqub, who is the vice president. The other vice president of the Taliban is from the Haqqani family. This is the Haqqani network in Pakistan. They play a very important role inside the Taliban. So these are not moderate men. They already are going to come in with a hard agenda. And don't be misled by the press conferences where people say, women can participate in public life as long as they follow the Islamic way. The Taliban said that in the 1990s, and so did the Mujahideen. They have a very specific understanding of what they mean by that. So don't be misled by that. What you have is not a moderate Taliban, but a more pragmatic Taliban. And let me explain that quickly, and then we can start a discussion. A couple of things about that. One, in this 20-year period, many Taliban leaders lived outside Afghanistan. Mullah Baradar, for instance, spent almost a decade in Doha in Qatar, traveled widely, went to Moscow, went to China, and so on. And so he has seen what the world is like. You got to remember that Mullah Umar didn't really leave Kandahar maybe to Kabul, Jalalabad, that nexus, but he didn't have a sense of the world. And he understood his location, which is fair enough. But Baradar has a broader sense, understand what's happening outside the world. So there's that cannot be underestimated. Secondly, in 1996, when the Taliban came to power, they were backed principally by Pakistani intelligence and others, but principally Pakistani intelligence, the ISI. Pakistan in 96 was different than now. Now Pakistan is in a very close relationship with the Chinese, particularly around the Belt and Road Initiative. Baradar, for instance, on the 28th of July was in Tianjin, had a very long meeting with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. They spoke, they had warm words and so on. Chinese ambassador in Kabul has met the Taliban. He's also met Hamid Karzai. He's also met Abdullah. They are playing a role here. So I don't think the Pakistanis can play the 1996 role. I think now China is much more gripped of the problems in Afghanistan. And I think the Afghans have to be a little pragmatic. Look, let's look at it financially. The United States Treasury has already put pressure on the IMF not to assist the Taliban government, which will be formed. It hasn't been formed yet. The World Bank is going to deny access to anything from the Taliban and so on. So they're going to get cut off from Western financial systems. What I think must have happened in Tianjin between Wang Yi and Baradar was that the Chinese said, look, we have two things on the table for you. Number one, we can't allow you to let these Uyghur groups operate, the terrorist groups operate in Afghanistan and attack Xinjiang. We just can't allow that. Secondly, we can't allow you to be in cahoots with anybody who's going to disrupt the Belt and Road. Just before the Taliban took Kabul, there was an attack on a bus carrying Chinese and Pakistani workers inside Pakistan that were working at a Belt and Road facility, and 9 people died in it. So I think that this is what the Chinese have put at the table, that they will invest in Afghanistan, perhaps build infrastructure and so on, but they will not tolerate any attacks on either the Belt and Road or in Xinjiang. And I think that's significant. We've got to pay attention to that. The reason I want to point that out is in this 20-year period, while the United States was occupying Afghanistan, during this whole 20-year period, almost no infrastructure was built. In fact, right now, 2/3 of Afghans have no electricity. Half of Afghans, at least 1/3 of Afghans are struggling with hunger. Half have no drinking water. 2/3 have no electricity. So, I think the Chinese are going to come in and they'll make some deal. This is a pragmatic Taliban. It's not a moderate Taliban. Their social agenda is going to be harsh. Where does the good side of history come from? It's not going to come from an ex-CIA agent sitting in the Panjshir Valley, I'm afraid. It's got to come from the slow incubation of mass struggles. We already see the bravery of the Afghan people coming out during Independence Day, the 102nd Independence Day, carrying Afghan flags, rejecting the Taliban flag and so on. Let's see where this develops. We must give people solidarity and strength to develop their own struggles. We got to also ensure that regional partners, India, Iran, Pakistan, the Central Asian states, China and so on, play a role in keeping the Taliban pragmatic and to perhaps push them to create a national reconciliation government, which Muhammad Najibullah had called for in the 1990s. This is what Hamid Karzai in Kabul is talking about. This is what Abdullah is talking about. He was the former head of the National Reconciliation Council under Ashraf Ghani. So maybe that's the way forward, is to fight to create a national government, give strength and solidarity to the Afghan people as they drive that old 100-year agenda, and not allow our minds to think that the only solution to the Taliban is Western bombing. I think we got to open a new road, friends. We got to open a road that's indigenous to Afghanistan's history and is authentic to left internationalism. That's got to be the road. It can't be from reliance on ex-CIA agents and things like that. Those fantasies should be set aside. And so that's where I'm going to leave it.
Okay, thank you, sir. That was a very elaborative one, and Yeah, the floor is like open for the questions. Before taking up the question, Irfan sir, would you like to comment on or add more to what Vijay sir has said?
No, I think let's go to the question. Dr. Vijay Prashad has laid out a very, very broad canvas, given us history.
Oh, I think he's maybe frozen.
Yeah, yeah, some technical issue. Uh, okay, maybe we'll take one question and maybe if we can add after that. So the first question is from Somnath. How does this situation modify the geopolitical situation? Will the Taliban obey the Pak military or does India have any opportunity?
Well, that's a great question from Somnath, and I very much hope that we come to the point where Afghanistan is no longer a battlefield for India and Pakistan to contest each other. That's how it often turns out, that India and Pakistan take the India-Pak rivalry into Afghanistan. I think that's objectionable. It should not be something that we would allow to happen. I think that the Indian External Affairs Minister was in Dushanbe in July for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization has a meeting of its Afghanistan contact group, and India's External Affairs Minister put forward a 3-point agenda, which was quite a reasonable agenda. That the Taliban should not promote extremism, that there should be protection of minorities, that there should be basically a broad-based government, and so on. I think that those 3 points were accepted by the Pakistanis, accepted by the Chinese, by everybody. I think that that's the good way to begin. That's a good starting point. But I really hope very much that the government of Mr. Narendra Modi and the government of Mr. Imran Khan, don't get into a kind of opportunity game where they use the Taliban's entry into Kabul as a way to undermine each other and thereby undermine Afghanistan. I mean, I would like to say to our friends in the neighborhood that can we for once put Afghanistan ahead of the petty rivalries that otherwise detain the countries and their considerable establishments, Pakistani intelligence, Indian funding, and so on. There's considerable influence that these countries have on Afghanistan. I hope we'll put some sort of united agenda forward to allow Afghanistan to come out of this war, which is not a 20-year war, Mira. That's the point. It's a war that has been going on since the 70s.
So moving on to the next question, which has been asked by Vaishak Balachandran. How will the rule of Taliban impact East Turkmenistan Islamic movement? Even though China is trying to establish normal ties with Taliban, do you see the possibility of US funding ETIM with the tacit support of Taliban to destabilize Xinjiang province?
Well, this is this. Look, you're very smart, Mira, because you gave me two questions which basically mirrors of each other. There's another Cold War that's in play, and that's the Cold War that the US wants to impose on China. The United States has been pushing this whole, encircle China, make China basically dial back on its science and technological gains. India is participating in this through the Quad with Japan, Australia, the United States. I just find that this is a very dangerous kind of politics that the US is doing with China. So I'm worried about this. To tell you the honest truth, I worry about this. In the last days of the Trump administration, his Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, removed the East Turkmenistan Islamic movement from the list of terrorist organizations. And now they're going to start fashioning these people as freedom fighters. I met some of these people in Turkey, at the border with Syria. These are some hardened, eager fighters. These are not liberal democratic people or whatever. These are fundamentalists. I mean, let's face it. Okay, I know the term fundamentalism is overused. I don't know what word to use. These are pretty nasty chaps. How about that? They are not interested in the 20. In our general orientation of sensitivity and. I mean, their reaction to women's emancipation is they pull out their guns. That's they don't even want to talk about it. So these are pretty rough guys, and the US has been working alongside them for a long time now. They've been operating in Syria. That's in fact where the Uyghur groups are based, is in Idlib province, where a lot of the jihadis are holed up in this one section of northwest Syria. And now the worry is that if the Taliban creates a government, will these Uyghur groups decamp from Idlib through Turkey and come to Afghanistan and set up in, maybe on the borders of Tajikistan and Turkmenistan up there, somewhere in the north, or with Uzbekistan, because you can't really go from Afghanistan into China. It's a 76-mile border, and it's a narrow natural reserve. It's hard to get there. You have to go through Uzbekistan and so on. So the danger is they'll set up there. But now we have to see, will the Turkish government allow them transit to Afghanistan? Will the Uzbek government allow them to operate through Uzbekistan into the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region of China? I think that the Taliban will not be so stupid as to antagonize the Chinese, because I think they recognize if the West cuts them off from getting financing for what they need to, that because it's a landlocked country, they will need some sort of economic assistance to advance the cause of the people. I mean, they're not ruthless, heartless people. I mean, they're going to have to do some sort of development for people, particularly with the destruction of the country. The physical plant is destroyed and so on. So I feel like they are not going to be that stupid. I mean, look, it's not true. If you look at the data, it's not true that Afghanistan relies on opium. By the way, opium is not even going to be the largest drug that Afghanistan exports. Coming up there is methamphetamine. Is a very big, there's a huge production of methamphetamine. The Taliban actually made their money not from taxing the drug trade. They made their money from taxing roads, because they controlled all the borders. If you look at a map of where the Taliban had established control from maybe 10 years ago, it was all the borders, including in the north. So they taxed the bridges and they taxed cigarette sales. I found this also in my reporting in North Africa. Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb was a major cigarette smuggler. They made their money through the cigarette trade, not through the drug trade. Although in the Maghreb, they also made their money in weapons trade, which they didn't in Afghanistan. So they're going to need some kind of financing from somewhere. 2/3 of the population without electricity. It's going to be hard to sustain that. So in that regard, I very much hope that their pragmatism kicks in. Because if Afghanistan becomes a base to attack China, the Chinese will retaliate. And that's catastrophic, that's catastrophic. Got to put this in context, okay? I'm sorry to go on so long, but put this in context. After the fall of the Soviet Union, many groups, right-wing, sort of jihadi type groups, grew in Uzbekistan, particularly Uzbekistan. The Islamic movement of Uzbekistan was a particularly ruthless organization. And they had very close ties with the Mujahideen and later with the Taliban. They fought with the Taliban against the US in 2001. The Russians have a big influence in Central Asia. So the Russians also don't want to see the Taliban emerge as that old, in other words, becoming a safe haven for Uzbek jihadis and jihadis from here, there, and everywhere, and including jihadis from Chechnya and Dagestan, from the Russian provinces up there near the Great Sea. They don't want the Taliban to allow that. So there will be Moscow's pressure. And Baradar visited Moscow in June. There'll be Moscow's pressure. There'll be Beijing's pressure and so on. So I actually feel a little confident. It's a crazy thing to say, okay? I feel a little confident that this particular issue may not become important. I think the Uyghur terrorists sitting in Idlib might have to remain there for a generation.
Okay, now we are having the third question by Arsha. Since Talibans are majority Pashtuns, how does that play into the politics of Afghanistan? why or how the other tribes accept their rule? Rule. Yeah.
So, I mean, look, you just need to look at the demography of Afghanistan, or whatever the demography is, because this is a huge contested terrain. The Pashto people are the majority, but the Pashto are not a unified group. This is like the way people talk about Hindus in India. If you look at demographically, Hindus are majority, but what Hindu? I mean, a Hindu Brahmin from Uttar Pradesh, what do they have in common with a Hindu from Kerala, for instance? I mean, is there really a Hindu community in India? I don't think so. I think it's just a cover-all political term. There's no religious term Hindu. To me, it's meaningless. In Kerala, you just celebrated Onam. Why don't the Hindus in the rest of India celebrate Onam? What's wrong with them, and so on. So I don't think there's really a Pashto community like that. There are Pashto speakers and so on, but even the Pashto people speak different languages. There are minority populations in Afghanistan. As Irfan talked about, there's the Hazaras, there's 20 other groups. But let's not allow ourselves to believe that the Pashto are singular, particularly because the so-called Durand line, which the British drew between Afghanistan and Pakistan, continues to be contested. And there is a large Pashto-speaking population on the so-called Pakistani side of the line. These Badshah Khan, Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan and so on. His grandson, I believe, is one of the leaders now of their party up in the northwest frontier. Mohsin Dawar, Ali Wazir, these members of the PTM, they don't accept the view of a singular Pashtun anything. They contest that. In fact, Mohsin Dawar, very brave politician. Ali Wazir is sitting in a Pakistani jail. Mohsin Dawar, brave politician. They had a huge mass rally recently in Waziristan calling for the Pakistani intelligence not to interfere in Afghanistan. I thought that was incredibly brave of Mohsin and his comrades. So I actually would like us to take a deep breath and not get into the kind of colonial ethnography or the colonial anthropology and believe that there are these tribes and they have, a tribe has a politics and so on. We are also people of the modern world, friends, and we all have politics and we have views of the world, and we develop ideological opinions and so on. Hamid Karzai, Abdul Haq, Muhammad Najibullah, all of them Pashtun, but they had such different views of the world. Imagine Burhanuddin Rabbani and Muhammad Dawood. I mean, both Pashtun. One wanted to imprison the other. So let's give up this colonial anthropological way of looking at the world. Tribes and so on.
So next question is from Adul. What are the prospects and challenges for an organized and effective resistance by the progressive forces within Afghanistan in the near future? So along with that question, I'm also posing question of Selvaraj. What is the strength of communist or left organizations in Afghanistan now?
You see, let me put it this way. I'm a very practical and pragmatic person. And I, many years ago, read the text by Amilcar Cabral, who was the leader of the guerrilla and national liberation struggle in Guinea-Bissau. And he said, tell no lies, claim no easy victories. A photograph comes of a flag at the edge of Panjshir Valley and it travels all around. So one person sitting with a flag. And the ex-CIA agent goes into the Panjshir Valley. People say, oh, he's going to lead the resistance and so on. Tell no lies, claim no easy victories. Firstly, I don't trust Mr. Saleh at all. I don't trust Masood at all. They work for the West whenever it suits them, not particularly people that one would, pay attention to for something like this. I'm very pessimistic about the possibilities of a left upsurge or a people's movement emerging and so on. Very pessimistic. Look at Algeria as an example. Algeria had a terrible fratricidal war, but much shorter than in Afghanistan, and that was the war when the Islamist militancy broke out in the 1990s against the government of Algeria, the kind of nationalist government. during the Arab Spring, I was in Algiers and I asked many people, why has there been no protest in Algiers as part of this Arab Spring? It starts in Tunisia, goes to Egypt, and why nothing in Algeria? And they said, we are tired. We did this in the 90s, or some people did this. The Islamists did it in the 90s. They were crushed and we're just tired. We don't want to risk something like this. And I fear that this attitude will set in Afghanistan. This had actually already set in the 1990s. When the Taliban came to power in 96, there was no appetite in the country to frontally confront the Taliban. Because the Taliban, as I said, did something clever. They said we are anti-corruption. And indeed, the evidence of corruption had decreased in the Taliban rule. Now, the other thing they did is they said we're going to squash the social future of most people. And that is something that is harder to contest, build popular alliances and so on. The women's movement is largely been crushed in Afghanistan. The popular women's movement. There was an elite women's movement, but people like that, they're on the first flight out of Kabul. They won't remain to build something. It's dangerous to build something there. You'll get killed. So I'm not optimistic about the emergence of a left. You'll get on the internet, some Maoist group, some this group, but I would like to again caution you. Many of these groups are not in Afghanistan. They are based either in Pakistan or in Europe and so on. Like the Today Party from Iran, the Iranian Communist Party is based in Germany. It's not based in Iran. So I don't want to just exaggerate things, but I did say earlier that I think the contradictions inside Afghanistan will provoke struggles of different kinds. And I hope those struggles will germinate and become stronger. The Afghan people will struggle against the limitations of their life. 50% have no drinking water. This is going to provoke struggles now. Earlier in the last 20 years, it was impossible to struggle because they were fighting everywhere. And war is antithetical to genuine politics of the left being developed. It's antithetical. So let's see, let's pause. We're just a week since the Taliban roared into Afghanistan. Take it easy, guys. Don't already start saying there's a left, there's a this, there's a that. Take it easy. Have some patience. Let the West evacuate the country. Let's see what their next steps are. Let's see what happens with the government formed. You see, if the Taliban decide to create something like a government of national reconciliation, some fig leaf government with Karzai and Abdullah and maybe a few other people, that will placate some regional partners and so on. And if they then say, we're going to create electricity and we're going to do this, that, and the other, let's see what the contradictions provoke. You don't have to impose a politics on a country. The country's politics must emerge from its people. The people must be in the lead here. Let's not have an imperialist mindset. How do we impose the politics on the country?
Dr. Vijay, if I can add some experience, although you may be right, I'm not contesting what you're saying at all. You know more about Afghanistan than I do. But some 7-8 years ago, my father was invited by Islamic organizations there to talk about gender justice in Islam. And he traveled he traveled quite a long distance in Afghanistan and spent several days and addressed all the religious leadership on gender justice. And he was ruthless in the sense, he was left and progressive. And he said Islam is about gender justice. And he would quote several verses from the Quran and the history, etc. Nowhere did he face opposition, except in the last meeting that was held, which was a larger meeting. One religious leader opposed him, questioned him, and opposed his position and said, this position will not work in Afghanistan. And those who were sitting on the dais quietened that person. I don't know if this means anything. I don't know if this means anything. What conclusions my father drew at that time, being an Islamic scholar, that he changed his opinion. That Afghanistan is conservative. He said there is a section that is demanding to know progressive Islam. I hope this is so. But I don't know. What you are saying might be right, and it does seem to me also to be right. That there are no easy solutions and tell no lies.
Yeah,
Okay.
just to pick up on that, Mira. Sorry, I feel that that's a very correct assessment, because obviously Islam is not one interpretation. I mean, this goes back to the great debates of Ghazali and the whole Falsafa tradition and so on. Not that I know much about it, but Fazlur Rahman was once my teacher, and between Fazlur Rahman and CM Naeem, I got an earful on the different debates in old Islam. So, those debates continue. And of course, they are there in a country like Afghanistan, where they're extremely learned scholars and so on, and people of great sympathy towards humanity. Of course, that's there. Whether that can translate into a politics is really what I'm more pessimistic about. I think Afghan society, as I said earlier, has a whole history of fighting for social reform. So the society has it within it. Whether they can translate that tendency into politics, that has been the difficulty. I'm going to say something that I've felt for a long time, but I think people like Burhanuddin Rabbani should be held responsible for this, because Mr. Rabbani, as the most senior professor of Islamic theology at the University of Kabul, took such a hard right position in creating the Jamaat-e-Islami at the time in the 1970s against reform, that it was people like him that become responsible for characterizing Islam in Afghanistan as having that narrow interpretation. It's totally untrue. I mean, there were other professors there who disagreed with him. I mean, I've met people in the university who have a different but they didn't create a politics. They didn't create the Jamaat-e-Islami in brackets reform, which could have been an interesting political contest. But they allowed people like Burhanuddin Rabbani to basically hold forth and interpret things. And the moderates, within just used to look to Rabbani for leadership. And they took advantage of that. They hid under Rabbani. When the Soviets came in, they made it a whole outlook that we are Muslims and we will not tolerate secularism. That's a Saudi outlook. That's what the Saudis used to say about Gamal Abdul Nasser. The Saudi attack on Nasser in the 1950s and 60s was, they used to say this is anti-Islamic. What makes Nasserism anti-Islamic? And I must say, even then, the Muslim Brotherhood colluded with the Saudis. Because, after all, Muhammad Qutb, the brother of the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, was a professor in Saudi Arabia. And he, used to hold forth about how Nasser and so on were anti-Islamic. Irfan, people have often said that the Saudi interpretation of Islam is anti-Islamic. So, but I don't believe that anything is anti-Islamic. I think this is a debate in a tradition. The Saudis have as right to their position, so do others. We should not have an attitude. It's like the attitude in the left. Who's a big real Marxist? Who's a non-Marxist? You have a tradition. You have a debate inside a tradition. It's perfectly acceptable. And you're right. There is a social reform tendency in Afghanistan, but it's not got the habits and power of politics.
Yeah, so moving on, the question asked by Deepak. Scholars like Asghar Ali Engineer were trying to develop Islamic theology of liberation, like what we see in Latin America as Christian liberation of theology. What do you think as the major reason for the failure of project of Islamic theology of liberation and the emergence of Islamic fundamentalism? Is it due to the failure of socialist nationalist government in those countries to deliver what they offered?
Well, I don't want to enter into a theological debate, but I can enter the political side of it. In 1964, in Riyadh, there was a meeting held by the Saudi king, where he had already cleared this with the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, British intelligence, and others, and he was interested in setting up an outfit that would basically promote a certain version of Islam to undermine nationalism, third world nationalism, Nasserism, and undermine socialism and communism. And that's the group that was formed called the World Muslim League, the Rabita. It was founded in 64 by the Saudis. And they set up offices all over. Now, what's interesting is, you look at the languages in which they published their materials. It was often the languages of the Soviet Union, because they would smuggle in text trying to use Islam to create a wedge inside the Soviet Union. They used their text to basically try and undermine the countries that had a Muslim population but had a third world nationalist agenda. They didn't have to do much in Indonesia, although that would have been the next stop, by the way, because very soon after there was a coup against the government of Sukarno. The World Muslim League founded in 1964. This coup was in 65, and General Suharto came to power. So they didn't need to deal with Indonesia, but they dealt with the rest of the world. And they started to fund not only the development of mosques and teaching institutions, but also paid salaries of imams. You know, it's interesting. Many years ago in Aleppo, is talking to a working class, organizer, and he was saying that in many of the Halab, the mosques in Aleppo's slum areas, you see, northern Syria suffered a terrible drought some years ago, and there was a large-scale migration into Aleppo. And these slums grew up. And in the slums, mosques appeared immediately. And these imams appeared immediately. And the mosques and imams are all funded by the Saudis. By the way, that's the base of this uprising in Syria, was in places like that. So these imams were basically made in Saudi Arabia. And they brought a Saudi approach. You see this in Malaysia, and you start to see this in South Asia. You know how people suddenly start to say Ramadan. They don't say Ramzan, they'll start to say Ramadan Kareem. And you say, what country are you living in? What Ramadan? For bloody hundreds of years, people have greeted each other on Ramzan. And you're now Ramadan Kareem. This is the Saudiization. But it doesn't come for free. It comes with petro money. So this contest around Islamic theology and so on, it's not a contest about the reading of the Quran. It's not a contest around better interpretations of the Quran. This is about petro money. This is about the Saudis creating institutions that undermine Islam everywhere. They undermine Islam everywhere. I'm saying something rather strong, Irfan. I don't know if this is right or wrong, but they undermine Islam. It's not like they're pushing an interpretation or something. Because think about it. You go into, I'm just talking about Calcutta. I was born in Calcutta. I grew up in an area where there was a very large Shia population. But in the center of town, you see these mosques coming with this hideous Gulf Arab architecture that doesn't belong in South Asia. The architecture doesn't belong. The mosques in Kerala, those beautiful, big, giant mosque buildings, and then you'll see this hideous desert architecture come in, it's as hideous as the downtown streets of Indian cities with all the glass and steel, it doesn't belong in Indian architecture, in Indian climate, because you have to air condition the whole building and it's a nightmare. Anyway, I'm going on and on. All I want to say is, it's not necessarily the failures of socialism or national liberation. In a book I wrote in 2007, Darker Nations, there's a section called Mecca, where I go into this in some detail. This was a fight that the Saudis, the CIA, and so on brought to the left, and they used Islam as a wedge, nowhere more effectively than Pakistan, which has suffered from this greatly. The fact that wonderful liberal and left people languished in the jails of Ziaul Haq at the behest of the Jamaat, at the behest of the US intelligence and so on, it should tell you about how our world was destroyed by their corruption.
Okay, now I'll combine two of the questions. One is being asked by Asha. What will happen to women's rights movements and how can they organize when crushing women's rights appeal to men? Along with the same, by Shilka, will the governance structure of the new Taliban be comparable to Iran or Saudi?
Well, I wouldn't put Iran and Saudi Arabia in the same sentence because Iran is a democracy. Now, it's a clerical democracy. The clerics control and manage the democracy, but it's a democracy. And there are a large number of women in public life and in politics and so on. And, there's no problem about women driving in Iran. In fact, one of the most shocking things I ever saw was a young woman with bungee cords, stretching cords attached to a car, roller skating behind the car in Tehran. Iran is not the same as Saudi Arabia. It's a big error for people to put these together. There's a kind of sphere of Islam that puts these things together. Iran is not at all like Saudi Arabia is, to my mind, a wretched place, frankly. Unless you're an expatriate banker or you're in the royal family, it's a tough place to live. High rates of poverty among the people, the Saudi citizens, and so on. And it's a tough place to be a South Asian domestic worker and so on. It's a completely different situation than Iran, friends. Iran doesn't import Indian workers to come and clean their toilets and whatever. It's a much more democratic society in that sense. If Afghanistan became more like Iran, it would actually be an advance from Afghanistan today. I'm telling you something very frankly, okay? So let's not mince around words. Iran also has a long journey ahead of it. It has a journey in terms of coming to terms with the fact of women's emancipation. Women's emancipation is not something we have to attain. It's a fact. Now we have to realize that fact. It's not a moral we have to win. It's already there. The world has accepted it. Now we have to realize that fact. So I don't think, I think in Iran, that's a journey. The Iranian women are fighting this. You don't have to help Iranian women, by the way. They will argue that you out of a paper bag. So they're doing fine. Saudi Arabia, it's a different matter. The debate is still around whether women should drive a car or go out without a guardian. As Irfan talked about, this guardianship system. It has a long way to go. But which one is the ally of imperialism? Which of the two is the ally of imperialism? Tell me now. It's not Iran, that's for sure. So is there a women's movement in Afghanistan? Actually, there was not a women's movement even before the Taliban took Kabul now. There was an elite women's network and sections and so on. And elite women were able to gain some advantages in society, but there was no mass struggle. And here we've got to go back to the communist period. Remember what I said, under Anahita Ratebzad and others, they pushed for a mass literacy campaign and for the undermining of landlordism. Big landlordism, is a material basis of the subjugation of women. You can't liberate women without at the same time ending landlordism and increasing literacy. So this 20-year US occupation didn't drive an agenda of land reform. It didn't drive an agenda of mass literacy, anything like that. What it did was it made Kabul into a relatively modern city. Because, to be fair, I wrote an article once and I said Hamid Karzai is the mayor of Kabul. He's not the president of Afghanistan. And so too Ashraf Ghani. Ashraf Ghani, in fact, was the president of the ARG. The ARG is the presidential building. He wasn't even the mayor of Kabul. So I just think that it's going to take time to germinate genuine mass struggles. It's not like the mass struggle was there. If there had been a mass struggle, it would have resisted in this last 20-year period, but it didn't exist.
So again, we are ending the session by asking the last final two questions combined. One has been asked by Mrinal. Since the Taliban are fighting against imperialist forces, can it be said that the Taliban are anti-imperialist? And next question is by Sartak. Will Afghan region be stable in next 10 years?
Well, Mrinal, come on, Mrinal. You got to learn a better modern form of mathematics. This is some prehistorical mathematics, plus and minus and so on. But just because somebody is against somebody doesn't mean that they are, your friend. I've never liked that attitude. The Taliban are certainly people committed to their country, certainly people committed to ruling their country in a certain way. But it's clear that they are not opposed to making all kinds of alliances and deals. We just don't know where the deals are going to be made. uh, they emerge out of the Pakistani intelligence system. We know that. That's well established. You can even read Ahmad Rashid's book to get that. You don't need to get any secret documents. Ahmad's book Taliban tells you that. And we know very well that the ISI was set up by the dictatorship of Zia-ul Haq to coordinate Pakistani assets with US assets in the Afghan campaign to undermine the communist government. So the ISI itself is basically an imperialist tool. We know that, or at least in its founding. So I don't, if you just go by that road, the Taliban is not anti-imperialist. The question is too without nuance. It's too clear cut, and I just think that anti-imperialism isn't being against the imperialists. Anti-imperialism has to have a positive content to it. And in my opinion, the only positive content to anti-imperialism is socialism. If you don't commit to socialism, you're not an anti-imperialist, because you'll collaborate with imperialism eventually. If you don't fight for land reform, you'll collaborate with imperialism eventually. Mr. Modi might make one or two gestures that look like he's fighting for the sovereignty of India, make in India and all that drama that he did. On the other side, they'll go and hug Trump. And, as Prakash Karat put it very well, they make India a subordinate ally of the United States, So, unless you're a socialist, you're not a real anti-imperialist. You can be against imperialism, but you're not an anti-imperialist. I mean, I would like to preserve, I'm sorry, I just said we should think of these things as a debate within a tradition. But this is a category, and I think a category can be specified. Sorry, Irfan, you want to say something?
Yeah, no, I would like to add something to this. What Taliban's position is that they don't want foreign soldiers on Afghan soil. That is not an anti-imperialist. It's at the most you can stretch it to anti-colonialist position, but they are not anti-imperialist. In fact, organizations like Taliban want to, they say that they want to make Islam as the empire. They want to replace this empire where they'll keep the nuts and bolts, the oppressive rule as same, except that they want to displace and put their laws and rules and govern the world. So they want to make Islam, they talk about Ummah, not just Taliban, but organizations like Taliban, Al-Qaeda, ISIS. They want an empire of Islamic empire to replace US empire. So that is not being anti-imperialist in any way. And I entirely agree with what Vijay Prashad said, that even otherwise, anti-imperialism has to have a positive content. You have to be anti-landlordism, you have to stand for equality, you have to stand for some positive agenda of welfare, of etc. etc. So I agree with Vijay Prashad.
And do you want to comment on what Afghanistan will look like in 10 years?
It can't be said actually. It's very very difficult. Forget 10 years. We don't know what will be the nature of Afghanistan after 10 days. The situation is developing, and it is developing, and we can't say. Except, I can say in the very long run, we have seen history go forward. At times it marches backward, it's forced backward, but the wheels of history go forward. I do see, aspirations of women, aspirations of minorities, aspirations of peasants in Afghanistan will someday kick in. Whether it will happen in 10 years, whether it will take longer, say 20 years or 50 years, that I don't know. But I know one thing from history, that the wheels of history turn forward.
Vijay sir, do you want to?
Well, firstly, I quite agree with that. And I almost wanted us to end on that prosaic note about the wheels of history. And I hope those wheels of history are not like the Jagannath Rath, which will grind us into dust, as Marx wrote in Capital Volume 1. But yes, indeed, I think that Irfan is right. You can't predict things like this. On the other hand, I think there are some scenarios, and I hope for the better end of the scenarios. For instance, I hope very much that the regional powers, including India, Pakistan, China, Iran, behave soberly, are able to put pressure on Afghan politics a little bit, see to the creation of some kind of national government, even if it's a kind of a facade. That this kind of government then enters into some relation with the Belt and Road or whatever, and you see electrification increase, you see water supply increase. Basic needs of the people must be delivered immediately, as quickly as possible, because this has been neglected since the 1970s. And then I would like to see, as we know, it's a dialectic of history. As people's conditions improve, the aspirations improve, and they just will not accept a way of life. And so, we have to have some material changes. I mean, I'm an old-fashioned Marxist. I don't believe that ideas and ideals move history along. We have the material conditions need to improve. And here we have an opportunity in something like the fact that Pakistan, China and all are involved in this big infrastructure game. Let it happen. India, sadly, is not got involved in this sort of Asian infrastructure building. Is sort of sitting with the United States, where they just wasted $2.4 trillion in this war in Afghanistan and are debating an infrastructure bill domestically for the US. They don't have the money to invest infrastructure outside. I wish India would reconsider this sort of hard line and come back to a non-aligned foreign policy and engage China, engage Pakistan, develop some of these Belt and Road things, come into this process a little bit, develop relations with others as well, Germany and whatever, but come into this process. As the material conditions of the Afghans increase a little, you get electricity, you get drinking water and so on, aspirations will rise. If you keep people without any kind of material conditions, it's hard to develop aspirations, it's hard to develop aspirations. And we've got to understand that in that way. As Marxists, we can't be idealistic about things. We have to have the hard edge of reality slap us in the face once in a while.
So with that, we are ending the question and answer section, and I would like to invite Prachi from PSO at TISS Hyderabad campus to deliver the vote of thanks. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. On behalf of the Progressive Students Forum TISS Mumbai and Progressive Students Organization TISS Hyderabad, I would like to extend my gratitude to the speaker for the day, Mr. Vijay, and the evening's chair, Mr. Irfan. I'm sure all of us are taking with us a lot of thoughts from this lecture, which would help us keep this conversation alive. Lastly, I would like to thank our listeners and viewers for their presence and active participation throughout the evening. Have a fruitful rest of the day ahead. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.